Many argue the wide range of social grants is turning South Africa into a welfare state, but new research from UCT has found it may actually increase the chances of finding work. It looked at the impact of the 350 Rand COVID-19 social relief of distress grant. And let's speak now to one of the co-authors, Tim Kohler, to find out more about this. Tim, thank you so much for your time. Let's just perhaps discuss what you have found, some of the benefits of the COVID-19 social grant.
Sure. Good morning, and thank you for having me. So this research, alongside my co-authors, Professor Haroon Borat and David de Villiers, based at the Development Policy Research Unit in the School of Economics at the University of Cape Town, was supported by the presidency within South Africa as well as the Agence Française de Développement and the EU delegation. And we tried to understand, although we know the grant's primary aim was to provide income support to a large vulnerable group of previously unreached individuals, we wanted to try and understand stimulus effects, as we call it. In other words, did the grant have any other sort of effect that was unintended, positive or negative? And we wanted to try and specifically understand those effects on the labor market. And what we found primarily was that although we know the grant's primary aim, it wasn't designed to do anything else other than just provide income support to a vulnerable group. We found that it indeed improved the labor market outcomes of recipients.
With that being said, I mean, let's just perhaps focus on that support, not only given to the millions of South Africans who are unemployed, but seeing that improvement in the labor market. Where exactly did you identify those improvements?
Sure. Well, we basically found that despite the relatively small size of the SRD, right, 350 Rand a month, so any effects that we do find or that we did find, we would expect to be quite small. So indeed, what we found was that the grant had significant but small labor market effects. Specifically, our modeling shows that receipt of the grant increased a recipient's probability of employment, of finding a job, by just under 3 percentage points. Now, in terms of magnitude, that is quite a small effect, but it is statistically significant. And these results specifically make it clear that, one, receipt of the grant did not even deter participation in the labor market, but instead enabled it, which is contrary to what many might believe. And specifically, we also find that these effects of the grant getting some individuals into work were driven by effects on wage employment. And what we mean by that is not self-employment, but instead working for someone for pay, and specifically employment in the formal sector as opposed to the informal sector. And those are two characteristics of jobs that are typically characterized by higher quality. Now, interestingly, I think it's important to know that we find these positive, although small effects, in the context of 2020 and 2021, which we all know is the context of the pandemic and relatively stringent lockdown regulations. So it's very plausible that effects very well may be larger in a non-lockdown environment. However, we haven't investigated work in that context, so more work would need to be done in that regard.
Yeah, and just speaking of your investigations, Tim, perhaps take us through the methods that you used in conducting this research.
Sure. So until now, there's been a lot of research done on the effects of the grant, but all of this research has been really important and fantastic, but descriptive in nature. And what I mean by that is that it's really difficult to distinguish a causal effect if we change X by this amount, what happens to Y, versus just a mere correlation. And there's good reason for this. Without an RCT or a randomized control trial, establishing a causal effect is really difficult. We can simply compare some outcome between grant recipients and non-recipients, and then we can attribute any difference in those outcomes to grant receipt. Now, that's not a very credible way of doing causal inference. And this is primarily because we know that recipients and non-recipients of the grant differ in many ways other than just receipt. And it's these differences in characteristics that themselves might explain the difference in outcomes that we see between recipients and non-recipients. So we can't just compare them. But what we can do is, in our method, what we do is we overcome this problem by using probably one of the most popular methods used by quantitative social scientists. And what this method does, without going to it in detail, is that it allows us to estimate what would have happened to SRD grant recipients if the SRD had not been introduced. And that's what we call a counterfactual. Now, if we just compare actual outcomes to this estimated counterfactual, that allows us to arrive at these causal effects.
And I also understand, before I let you go, that you further analysed how, these effects vary in terms of how long the individual actually had received that grant.
Yes, and we consider that aspect of our study quite important because examining the dynamics of effects over time allows us to understand beyond the initial impact of the grant, as well as if the grant is seen as a more temporary or more permanent change in someone's income. And what we find that these employment effects are larger when individuals first receive the grant, but with additional periods of receipt, we find that that effect steadily reduces to zero. Which simply suggests that any labour market effects of the grant, again, even though it's not designed for this purpose, but these labour market effects that we do see are stronger in the short term, but then dissipate with time.
All right, well, I appreciate you speaking to us about this. Tim, Kohler, thank you so much for your time. PhD candidates from the School of Economics at UCT for speaking to us. Interestingly, the latest study conducted by Tim and his co-authors, finding that special COVID-19 grants don't only provide, I suppose, income relief, but also we're seeing a significant improvement in the labour market outcomes. So, our thanks to Tim, Kohler.